Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Scientific Mediation Climate Change Debate. So I'll be the moderator, Ambria Williams. And so you all should know the debate format by now. It is, we're going to start with a 3-minute introduction for each side, and then we're going to move into a 10-minute section for each side where each of you will ask, where each of you will have the opportunity to debate for another team's side. And then we're going to move into another 10-minute discussion where each of you will say why or why not you disagree with the other groups, and you'll have the opportunity to ask questions to each other. So I just want to start off by saying, please remain respectful during this debate. And if you have any questions, please feel free to add them in the chat and I'll answer them for you. Yeah, are there any other questions before we begin?
Is it a hard 3-minute stop for the intro, or is there like a 30-second grace period or something?
I'm gonna bang my gavel when your time is completely up, but I'm gonna also put in the chat when you have like 30 seconds left. Okay, does that work for everybody? All right, so do you guys want to introduce yourselves? Just like say who you are and like what side you're arguing for.
Okay, so hi guys, I'm Jerry and I'm on the side of refugee.
Okay, Brant.
Hi, everyone. I'm Brant, and I'm going to be representing corporations, specifically fossil fuel companies inside the US.
And then, Gabe.
I'm Gabriel. I am representing environmentalists, both in the US and abroad.
All right, so now that everybody's introduced themselves, we should go ahead and get started. But before we do, I'm just going to say or talk about what exactly scientific mediation is. So scientific mediation is a newer approach to actually solving issues that are related to science. So like, for example, climate change, energy, medicine. And so it's a way for both scientists and policymakers to come together in order to solve these issues. And essentially the purpose is for each side to represent what their arguments and concerns are, and then to understand what their opponents' sides are, so that we can understand what everybody disagrees on and what everybody also agrees on, so that we can move forward and find new ways to actually like solve the issue. So with that being said, we're going to go ahead and get started. Is there a preference for anyone who wants to go first? You guys can decide what form, like what the schedule is, I guess. Like, does anybody want to go first?
I can go first.
Okay, so we can, before you start, Jay, I just want to make sure that we have the layout ready. So you're the citizen of the village. So who wants to go after Jerry?
I'll go after Jerry. I'll go after Jerry.
So it's first Jerry, Gabe, and then Brant. Okay, that's for my records. All right, with that being said.
Oh, so we only have 3 sides, not 5 sides.
Yeah, there's only 3 sides.
All right.
All right, Jerry, I'm gonna set my timer for 3 minutes. Cool. And then I'm gonna put it in the chat when you have like 30 seconds left, and then I'll bang my gavel when you're completely out of time.
Sure.
All right, you may begin when ready.
Okay. All right, I shall start. So since I'm discussing like the refugee side, and I will specifically mention the 2 specific groups, actually 3 specific groups that was and will be deeply impacted by global warming. The first is all poor countries like in Africa and Middle East. And the reason is that global warming would cause famine. Because global warming, the reason for one of the most important reasons for global warming is excess carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide would kill plants and eventually decrease rainfall. And less rainfall would first lead to less food production and also less water. So yeah, it will cause conflicts and famine. That's just inevitable. But it's especially noticeable in poor countries. And another group that will be influenced by global warming would be the fishermen and all the seafood production. And the reason is, again, the carbon dioxide would acidify the ocean and will kill a bunch of, it will kill many sea bios and will result in less sea products. And indeed, this will lead to famine. But the first group that received its impact will be fishermen. In a more broad sense, that I believe that the whole humanity suffers from global warming. And one of the most significant impact of global warming is the meltdown of glaciers, which would rise the sea level. And this will cause immediate problem to many island countries, but in long term, it would inevitably bring grave issues to all countries. So yeah, that's pretty much all I got.
All right, thank you, Jerry. Gabe, you'll now be recognized for 3 minutes.
So I think the first thing that needs to be discussed before we talk about solutions to this is understand why we're here in the first place, why we need to have this conversation in the first place. And the reason for this is because for many decades now, massive corporations and even governments and government politicians have continuously denied the reality of climate change. A very famous example of this was when ExxonMobil from the 1970s to the 1980s funded internal collaborations and studies in order to understand the potential consequences of climate change. When they realized that the results of the study would hurt their profit motives, they then went on a massive lobbying campaign from the 1980s to the 2000s in order to sow seeds of doubt for climate change, embolden climate change denialism, oppose any sort of regulations that would benefit the climate on their companies and other oil companies. And they also sought to undermine public opinion on the scientific consensus of climate change. Now, if we lived in a fair world, all the people who allowed this to happen would be imprisoned for crimes against humanity. But unfortunately, that's not the case. So now, people need to actually step up and fix the problems. Now, one of the biggest problems with messaging the climate change issue is that, and this is actually part of the lobbying that corporations did, was turning the issue of climate change from a collective fault to an individual fault. Oh, just use plastic straws, drive electric cars, use public transportations, don't use the elevator. Now, all these things do help, and they probably make you feel good. But it doesn't stop from massive storms destroying power grids, coastal cities being flooded, where people die and then have to lose their entire homes, and so on. The reality is that about 100 corporations produce 70% of global climate change. And the top 25 of those produce half of all global climate change. So how can we fix this? Well, we already know that the people who allowed these things to happen will not face justice. So instead, the most important thing to do is to apply pressure to politicians and to those same corporations collectively as groups. Now, the best way to enact green policy is to combine it with a jobs program. By combining green energy with a jobs program, not only does it tackle the severity of climate change with the reaction it needs, but it also allows so that people, especially those in the more impoverished countries, can find a good paying job and can develop a future for themselves and for their children. That's all for my opening remarks.
Thank you, Gabe. Brant, you'll now be recognized for 3 minutes.
Awesome. So I'm Brant. I'm representing US fossil fuel corporations And the first thing that I want to make very clear is climate change is a real and very present danger. If we do not solve the impact of climate change, it will displace millions of people around the globe. It will create famine, and it will ultimately lead to a lot of people dying, which means the goal of this discussion should be trying to find solutions to the impacts of climate change, not whether climate change exists or not. So knowing that, there are three main things I want to focus on. The first of which is this idea of geoengineering. So if you've been paying attention to climate change experts in the past 30 years, you've probably heard of terms called tipping points. So for example, one form of tipping point is the idea of carbon dioxide getting trapped in the atmosphere, which strengthens the atmosphere, which results in when thermal energy comes into the Earth, instead of it getting reflected back out and temporarily heating the Earth, it gets trapped on the inside, it continues to heat the Earth. The problem with this is, even if we stop all of our emissions right now, that heating cycle is going to occur, which means the impacts of climate change are going to manifest, which means one of our goals needs to be not just reducing our impact on climate change, but solving climate change by actually taking that carbon out of the air, which means geoengineering. There are two main solutions that come with geoengineering. One is carbon sequestration, which is the idea that you can actually pull carbon out of the air to allow solar energy to once again leave the Earth. Another solution is aerosols, which you can inject into the air, which reflects solar energy back out into the atmosphere or back out into space to make sure that we aren't overheating. So we need to focus on preventing climate change naturally from happening, because we've already passed a lot of these tipping points, than just preventing our continual impact on climate change. The other thing I want to recognize is that we need a global solution to climate change. So when it comes to the US, according to the New York Times in 2019, we are only responsible for 14% of global emissions. And out of that 14%, fossil fuel companies are only responsible for 23% of those emissions, which means even if we suddenly destroyed all US fossil fuel industries, that would only reduce global emissions by 2%, which means we need to focus on a collective global approach to climate change if we really want to solve the issue. And lastly, I just want to point out that if we don't have sort of job programs, which is what Gabe talked about, it would be catastrophic to the US economy. Currently, the fossil fuel industry is integral to the US economy, and it currently employs 10 million Americans, which means if it went under, it would cause more unemployment than the Great Recession, which means that we really need to focus on making sure that the fossil fuel industry doesn't get destroyed instantly, and we can slowly phase it out, and make sure that we have opportunity for everyone while addressing the real problems of climate change.
All right, thank you, Brent. So now we're gonna move into the second portion of our debate, where each of you will have the opportunity to argue for someone else's side, or you can also argue against someone else's side. It's up to you. You'll actually have 5 minutes instead of 10. Unless you guys want 10 minutes, we can be flexible with that. Do you guys want 10 minutes each? Or 5 minutes?
Like how can we defend other side, or like what
you
should
can
we?
either announce your support or your like, I guess, dissent against one of your opponents. That's the point of the second portion.
Okay.
I think 5 minutes for individual talk sounds good. And
Okay.
then we can save a lot more time for when we have the open discussion and questions.
Okay, awesome. So with that being said, Jerry, you'll have about 5 minutes. Do you need any extra time to like prepare?
Nah, I think I'm good.
Okay. Let me know when you're ready. And the timer is starting now.
Okay. So I definitely agree with Gabe's opinion that compares to Brand's solution. Like Brand's solution is more about methods, like for example, aerosol that would reflect the reflects the solar energy back to the universe. But I agree with Gabe's opinion more, since I consider this is not really a scientific issue. I mean, it is, but that's not the central case. Like the central issue is more a political issue, like Gabe has said. First, that many even great politicians, like, they don't understand science, and clearly they see that some methods against global warming may reduce the economic benefit. So they either claim that it is just a conspiracy, or they just ignore it at all. And that must be a grave issue. And the worst case is this kind of trend actually spreads through more people around. Like, people just think that, especially like in those poor countries, since well, I mean, they were deeply harmed by the global warming, but simultaneously something happens, like they think that the developed country, like, they produced most warm gas. So like, what they should do is like to produce more, so they can establish like their industry. Anyway, like, I agree with Gabe's opinion that it is more a political issue rather from a scientific issue, and only certain political methods, like only like through certain political agreements among all countries, and we will finally be able to reach a possible solution for this universal problem. And that would be my position.
Okay, so Gabe, you'll now be recognized for 5 minutes.
So while I can appreciate that Brandt started off his opening remarks by saying climate change is indeed real, might be a little bit, too little too late. One thing that we need to realize, a rather unfortunate truth, is that in order to fix climate change at a global scale, like how Grant wants it to be fixed, you're going to have to kind of remove some of the profit motives entirely. Because the issue is that while, yes, maybe the US in itself is not the largest contributor towards climate change, the US military does, harbor a lot of oil, and as a consequence of that, they do pollute a lot still. A lot of the other countries that also pollute a lot are typically countries that have already industrialized or are beginning to industrialize and develop. Now, those countries that are much poorer, that do not have the infrastructure to industrialize and grow in wealth and in prosperity, are now going to look at all the other countries telling them, hey, you can't use the same tactics that got us rich, so you better find a way to, get up to our level. And they're probably going to be a little bit upset about that. So the biggest method to fix this would be that if massive innovations are made, such as the methods that Grant described, they should then be able to be shared with other countries without any threat of indebting them to much bigger countries. Already, a lot of countries in the global south have been taken advantage of by countries in the global north. Another issue, of course, is the timeline. Currently, there are agreements in place and summits that have been held, such as the one Biden held a few days ago, and the most famous being the Paris Climate Agreement. However, the goals they have set out in those agreements are akin to a Band-Aid over a gaping, gushing wound. A reminder here that global crop failures will occur by 2 degrees Celsius. Most humans would be dead by 4 degrees Celsius, and to make matters worse, if it could even get worse after that, was that Earth would be uninhabitable by 6 degrees Celsius. We risk reaching 2 degrees Celsius by 2035. We risk reaching 4 degrees Celsius by 2065, and we risk reaching 6 degrees Celsius by 2095. So the fact of the matter is that we really need to treat climate change as if it is akin to a global world war. Except we can't bomb this enemy into oblivion. We have to actually put our brains together and work together. And as a consequence of that, we also might have to get rid of some of the profit motives that already today we can see with the COVID pandemic makes it a little bit difficult to actually develop a global response.
All right, thank you, Gabe. So Brant, you'll now be recognized for 5 minutes.
All right, so I'd just like to start by saying once again, I actually think we're all on the same side when it comes to identifying climate change as a very real threat, and that we need to take very rapid, we need to seek rapid solutions to climate change. Because Gabe said, if we don't do anything in the next 20 years, we're basically all screwed. The place where we differ is the kind of solutions that we're talking about. So when Gabe comes up and tells you that, oh, we need to remove the profit motivation and we need to kind of destroy these industries, that's not feasible for a couple of reasons. First off, Jerry points out that this is a political issue, not a scientific issue. If we had always been following the science, we would have solved climate change like 50 years ago, and this would have never become a problem, which means the key to actually creating climate solutions are ones that are going to be politically feasible, because those are the ones that the US will adopt, those are the ones that the UK will adopt, those are the ones that every single country around the globe can adopt. If we are seeking policies that will decimate industries, no countries are going to jump on board, which means the goal of climate policies needs to be A, expansive, but B, also accessible for countries to sign on to. That's why I think personally that it's not about removing the profit incentive, it's about hyper accelerating the profit incentive and trying to direct it in the right direction. So right now, the problem is lobbies control DC. They control a lot of other countries, and that's why we can't like start to shift away from fossil fuels. However, one solution to this is if we start shifting towards just kind of preventing that problem to actual solutions, which are geoengineering. So for example, the federal government, instead of removing billions of dollars of tax revenue by destroying industries, can instead take out millions of dollars and send that in forms of scientific grants to these industries so we can start to invest in R&D to try and find out new forms of carbon sequestration and other solutions to climate change that wouldn't only reduce our emissions, but also prevent already accelerating aspects of climate change. And when Gabe mentions that we need to share this tech with other countries, I 100% agree. The whole point is we need to create this technology as fast as possible and then start spreading it around the globe. The only difference is we believe that the best way to do this is by investing in already energy sector inside the US. The reason being is we are already working on a lot of the things that Gabe is talking about. Fossil fuel industries are the ones pioneering carbon sequestration right now. The reason why is the profit motive is great. The idea is you get to suck out carbon, which is free in the air, you can turn it into energy, and then you can sell the energy, which means it has the best profit margins out of anything on the planet, which means if the US can keep giving them money so we can invest in this technology, then the US can buy that technology from these companies and give it around the world to start to solve climate change, which means that we can actually start to solve all of the problems that we all agree are very real. So A, great solution to our current climate change, as well as already natural accelerating climate change. And B, is it's really politically feasible, because this isn't about destroying jobs. It's about giving more money to R&D to create the technology to leap us forward and make sure that we aren't held back in a world that's going to be on fire.
All right, thank you, Brant. So now we're going to move into the third section of the debate, where you each get to ask each other questions, and there's more of an open dialogue between the three of you. So I'm going to give each of you 10 minutes that's mainly dedicated to yourself, and you'll be able to ask the other two questions, and then we'll move down the list. So are there any questions? Are we good? Good. Okay, cool. So Jerry, you'll now be recognized for 10 minutes. You may ask questions to either Brant or Gabe.
Yeah. So this question is for both Brant and Gabe, since we're pretty much on the same side, that we all know that it is rather a political issue. I mean, at least as a central issue. But like Brant specifically says that it is very feasible. Like you guys have a different, that Gabe says there should be no profit motive, but Brant says like there should still be profit motive. It's just we need to direct it into a good way. I wish Brant could explain that the kind of feasibility a bit more. And because I don't think it's very feasible. Like, I wonder, like, how could you actually redirect this profit feasibility? Because I mean, he mentioned that we could invest more money like into research, into technologies, but I strongly doubt that the majority fund would go into that direction, like, ever. Like, for sure, like, there are some rich people that are quite aware of the issue here, but not all of them are. And like, fossil fuel company, like mentioned by Brand, that we may be able to like produce, we may be utilize some better technologies to reduce the population. But like, I wonder, like, how is that feasible? Because that sounds so far. Like, I don't know, like, how could you actually direct that motive? And that's my greatest question.
Yeah, and it's a very real question, because this technology, like, you don't see it on the street, so it seems kind of very futuristic in sense. So the best way for me to address this is by explaining that carbon sequestration has already been proven to work. They've already created the mechanisms for carbon sequestration. They've figured out the science. It's just very difficult to kind of expand, because you need a lot of funding to figure out how to make these sort of things scalable. And the problem is, fossil fuel companies right now, they know 100% that they're making profit with their current like industry, and they need to keep putting money into that industry to remain competitive. Whereas investing in carbon sequestration is incredibly expensive, high risk, because if they invest in there and it doesn't pan out, then they're not staying competitive on the fossil fuel side, and then they're pushed out of business. But the profit margins here are insane, because every single other corporation that's operating in the fuel industry has to extract some sort of resource to make their business function. So in China, they're investing a lot in coal energy, which means that they're still going to have to pay a lot of money to get the coal out of the ground. However, if US companies created carbon sequestration, you don't have to do that anymore. You're not paying for that. They just grab the carbon out of the air and they make energy, which means that it's incredibly profitable. The only problem is it's so risky, and they need the capital to start to invest. So I agree, it's going to be very expensive, but I think that if the US really wanted to do it, they could do it. It's like how Gabe explained it earlier. Climate change is as big of a threat to us as other enemies have been throughout our history that we've waged war on. In those wars, we've spent trillions of dollars. Yet right now, we are unwilling to even spend a couple billion toward investing in R&D to try and solve a threat that's even greater than any of these enemies, which means we just have to fundamentally rethink what climate change is. We need to designate it a threat as big as any world enemy that could lead to our annihilation. And we need the federal government to start spending lots and lots of money into these sort of programs so we can scale up this industry. But the technology is there, we just need the money, which would come from the federal government, and they just have to spend as much as they do when it comes to military.
So Brandt had a slight moment of self-realization there when he talked about how certain tactics such as geoengineering and carbon sequestering, which I think for conciseness, I'll just call it carbon capture, is a little bit of a problem. And that is that the risks of it are incredibly high. And given the risks of not doing anything, I don't think we should have to risk with doing something that could, in fact, make the climate problem worse. The issue with certain ideas such as carbon capturing and geoengineering is that a lot of big businesses approve of those methods because it can be used then for them to continue using fossil fuels. The issue is that if you want to use carbon capture and geoengineering, you have to be using them at the same time while transitioning the entire energy of the world to be green. The climate change has already warmed the planet over 1 degree Celsius to pre-industrial levels, paradoxically cleaning up the air pollution that's currently masking some of the global warming would raise temperatures to another 1/2 or 1 degree. This means that if we waved a magic wand and suddenly stopped using fossil fuels, we would already be breaching 1.5 degrees Celsius. And the carbon budget is not an exact science. It seems that we've been hovering at a point where 1.5 degree of warming is locked in by what we have already emitted. And to put it differently, the most recent scientific evidence suggests that we have 0 to 5 years before every additional ton of carbon dioxide emitted would need to be compensated by a ton of negative emissions to stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius. So even in a scenario where renewables, electrification, and energy efficiency were aggressively pushed, and say 80% of meats and eggs were replaced with lab meat or artificial eggs, flying would need to be reduced, and tumble dryers were eliminated, it could not eliminate the need for carbon removal. It still requires about 400 billion tons of carbon dioxide to be removed via reforestation. And even reforestation sounds great and green, but it also has the potential to result in disposition, conflict over land access, and worsened livelihoods for smallholders. So the issue is, of course, what is their ultimate goal here? Do they want to use concepts such as carbon capture and geoengineering as a way so that they can continue using fossil fuels in the future? So, because in that case, you're just sweeping the problem under the rug. The purpose of using carbon capture and geoengineering is so that it's being done during the transition phase between fossil fuels to actual fully green energy. And unfortunately, for many big business leaders, maybe not Brent, in particular, but for some of them, they simply only want to use the carbon capture and geoengineering as a way to essentially keep doing what they've been doing for decades now. And that's really what the big problem is here, is that if we let these people keep doing what they've been doing and just basically apply a little side project such as carbon capture or geoengineering, then, well, they're going to still be contributing to the problem. And again, a lot of these technologies are extremely expensive. The technology for them has not been completed yet, and it might still take decades for them to actually be available widespread for it to work. And by then, it might be too late to address the problem.
All right, Brent, you had a comment.
Am I allowed to respond, or should we just keep going Q&A?
You can respond.
All right, great. So a lot of things to unpack there. So first is the argument that we just want to use carbon sequestration and geoengineering as an excuse to continue operating the fossil fuel industry. There's a couple things here. First off, if we succeed in carbon sequestration technology, there's literally no need anymore for the fossil fuel industry, because the operation of carbon sequestration is we can take carbon, turn it to energy, and sell that energy, which means A, our profit margins are insane because, once again, we're not paying for natural resources. Carbon dioxide in the air is free. And so, which means we're just going to outcompete every other industry. And then also, it's perfectly clean because every single energy that we are emitting automatically just gets sucked back up, which means we don't have a problem anymore. But even if, hypothetically, this wasn't the case, it's not necessarily a problem that we continue to admit if we're also solving the problems of emissions, right? Like, the only reason fossil fuel burning right now is bad is because it creates climate change, and climate change causes problems. However, if it didn't cause climate change because we could stop it with geoengineering, then admitting isn't a bad thing anymore, which means that if we can successfully find ways to implement geoengineering and stop the impacts of climate change, then it isn't necessarily a bad thing that we continue to admit, because that emissions just get removed and climate change doesn't have any impact on climate change.
Okay, so that wraps up Jerry's time for the Q&A. Now, Gabe, you'll be recognized for 10 minutes and you can ask a question too, either or.
So since I've been bullying Brant a little bit too much, I might move on to Jerry for a few questions. My first question, if you are representing the citizens of the village or climate refugees is, of course, how is the climate crisis able to be dealt with in a way that can support your own countries of origin and, of course, countries in the global south, because again, that's the main issue here at hand, is that for many industries, not just fossil fuels or energy, but many industries across the world, globally, have relied on a continuative exploitation of the global south and its resources. I mean, a great example here would be how in 2019 there was the whole political unrest in Bolivia, and how perhaps that may have been motivated due to their very rich storages of lithium, which is required for electric cars. So just like how I said earlier, the climate change issue is not economical, and it's not just an economical issue, it's a political issue. It's also directly tied into global violence, because a lot of disputes over land territory can be done because of religious reasons or for territorial reasons, but it can also be done for sources. I mean, we're not going to forget, the Iraq War, right? How much oil we ended up getting out of that. A lot of those fossil fuel companies were very happy despite how many people had to die. So how can, as a person who is representing the climate refugees, how can globally we treat this issue of the severity it needs, while also treating neighboring countries and even perhaps countries we may share disagreements with on other issues with enough respect, so that there isn't a conflict within the conflict of attempting to solve the issue of climate change?
Okay, so honestly, that my position is still a bit different from both of you guys. That my view on this question is actually pretty negative. That, well, we all recognize it's a political problem, but my opinion is, under current global situation, that this problem is just unsolvable. Because first, your argument is very true, that it is not, like Brandt's argument is quite true, that it is not really possible to remove the motive of profit. And I would say that no politician or entrepreneur would risk so high to bring the significant change. So my suggestion would be to go from rather minor and more aspects, like from our daily life. Like, for example, that meat industry that would also cause like great populations. But right now, the popular concept that vegan meat, that would solve a part of the problem. And of course, another important aspect that we need to notice is still a lot of people are quite unaware of this thing, that if we want, if we want to globally solve this issue, at least we need that everyone to acknowledge this issue. So we should have more funds, in making people know more about this issue. So in general, I don't quite agree with you guys' solution that an amazing new technology would solve every problem. Like, I'd rather believe a continuous, gradual process that, well, I mean, it's not only a process of technical advance, but also like an advanced acknowledgement of all human beings around the situation of the Earth. But I would say that it would be very far from the succeed of such a plan, because it is fairly true that even you would admit that those underdeveloped countries would not have like the industry system in developed country, and they will need those industry systems to feed themselves. So I would say protecting environment, like, my view is more or less negative on it, because I don't think, like, we could think about how to solve it, but I don't really have a solution for that at all.
Okay, thank you, Jerry. All right, back to bullying Brand a little bit. I have a bit of a concern with the argument for geoengineering, because from what I've heard at least, all proposed geoengineering techniques, if deployed at the massive scale necessary to affect climate change, they would have significant impacts on the environment, biodiversity, and livelihoods and food security. And some of the techniques, particularly those in the vein of solar radiation management, have military origins and could be weaponized as a way of controlling temperature and rain patterns. So, certain techniques like carbon capture and storage, you know, these things have always also been promoted by the fossil fuel industries, which again were the main culprits and the large profiteers of climate change. So I've heard a lot of proponents of geoengineering recognize that it would create losers and winners, and some places may benefit from the intentional atmospheric changes, but others will suffer, right? If you inject sulfate aerosols into the stratosphere above the Arctic to mimic, volcano clouds, for example, it could disrupt the monsoons in Asia and increase droughts in Africa, and would endanger food and water sources for billions of people. And those are just the potential side effects for the most thoroughly researched solar radiation management proposals. Less well understood proposals could be worse. So of course, even though this may fix the problem of climate change, how does it, how do we make sure it doesn't end up falling to the wrong hands? Because, governments tend to do pretty horrible things with, their military technology.
Yeah, no, those are all very, very valid concerns. As corporations, I mean, we're scared of the military as well. Like, we don't like to operate within that sphere. But our belief when it comes to, technology that has origins in the military, it isn't always necessarily bad. Like, for example, GPS was created by the military, and it's something that has revolutionized the way we use travel. And I would recognize that, so I don't necessarily think that's a bad idea, but I would recognize that these are technologies that could be adopted by the government, by governments, and weaponized. My view on it is twofold. First is that the truth is, if we're talking about the militaries who had access to this technology, like the US, China, maybe Russia, India, all of these countries already have weapons that are so much powerful, more powerful than simply like stopping rainwater. Like, these countries have nuclear weapons, they have destroyers, they have drones, and by the time this technology gets as advanced as it is, they'll have even stronger weapons by that point. My other issue on that front is, I just believe that the threat of these countries having slightly stronger military technology does not compare to the actual damage climate change can cause. As we all acknowledge, like, climate change will kill millions, if not billions of people with certainty, versus we don't know how many more people will die now that the military has this technology, even if they choose to use this technology. So on a cost benefit analysis, I think we should be prioritizing solving climate change above like worrying about military technology. But also I believe that's why I don't think this should necessarily, like, we should pursue climate policy country by country, because I think that can be dangerous because it can lead to exactly kind of what you're talking about, arms races, which is why I think like an international approach is very important, which I emphasized in my beginning speech about how we need to focus on global solutions in which everyone can be part of the conversation. Because I completely recognize that if one country gets to choose where we inject aerosols, it'll have a disproportionate impact on certain areas. And then the last thing I would like to say is, I agree with you that right now the aerosol solutions aren't fantastic. That's why we're not proposing like we rush into these solutions and start injecting. What we want is to get the money to start investing in research to discover the exact harms that you're talking about and possible solutions to these harms to make aerosols as least deadly as possible. Because eventually we're going to have to stop climate change somehow. We're going to have to take these carbon negative steps. And it's better that we start researching them now versus in the future when we actually need them, we rush into these exact scenarios that you're talking about.
Right, so that concludes Gabe's time. Brant, you'll now be recognized for 10 minutes, and you may ask a question to either Gabe or Jerry.
Awesome. So I have the same question for both of you. So you can decide who wants to go first. My question is, if theoretically you controlled all of international policy, you get to make the decision. What exact policies would you want to push for and implement right now? We can start with Jerry, or if Jerry wants some time to think, Gabe can go.
Yeah, I need some time to think for sure.
Yeah, no, it's a big question.
Yeah, so I think, again, I personally don't like to delve into hypotheticals, especially when it comes to, controlling all of international politics, because that tends to cause major, you have to take into consideration so many things, so many geopolitical issues that are happening at once. My main solution would be to address the climate change issue in a way that is detached from any type of private influence or interference, because I think, as we saw with the ExxonMobil scandal, when you have people who have the power to do the right thing but are manipulated through greed or lobbyists or other motivators, they could end up doing the wrong thing because they know that they will personally benefit from it. So I would want to work in a way that allows for countries that can do it to, if it is feasible for them, to nationalize likely their energy sectors. Some countries have done this. Some of them have done it with extreme blowback through the international scale. But if I'm calling the shots here, I wouldn't potentially worry about that. The biggest concern for me is making sure that the climate crisis is addressed in a way that allows for it to be solved, but for it to also be used as a way to elevate everybody's standard of living and as a way to elevate people who perhaps don't have opportunities, who perhaps might, be, lacking in other resources, to be able to have access to a job that not only helps the planet, but it also helps them receive a good good paying job so that they can sustain a healthy family and a healthy community. Which is why what still concerns me is just how expensive green energy is for a lot of communities. I think because it's so expensive, it makes it so that it's very difficult for people to get on board. Now, of course, you always have those tax incentives and the like, but even that is not enough for someone who is living, say, paycheck to paycheck. They're simply not going to be able to afford an affordable electric car. Of course, we could just, do what, liberal and even conservative and even liberal economists do, and just wait for the market to find a solution. But again, time is not our friend here. We are running out of time. So we need to find ways, again, to make these technologies be available to as many people as possible in a way that might not necessarily give these companies massive profits, but in the long term will save people's lives. Which, hey, I think if you run a company, you kind of need people in order for it to work. If you don't have anyone working for you, well, the company doesn't really exist. So again, that's my main concern, and that's how I would want to fix it. I would want it to be something that not only fixes the planet, but it also elevates everybody's standard of living, and it helps those who perhaps up to this point did not have a good standard of living or were unable to access a good standard of living. Maybe instead of, joining the military and, killing people in order to get oil for those same fossil fuel companies, maybe instead you can, help fight the war against climate change without, having to kill people.
Okay, then I will go with my solution. That since I've already stated, I'm not so optimistic in human nature that people will sacrifice their own benefit for the universal good. I think the only policy I could say here just escapes opinions that I wouldn't really like to make a lot of if situations. The only policy I would set is to put more funds in research. Like, it would be really funny that since I say it is a political issue, but I don't think any political methods could actually solve it. No, but I think we need scientific research to solve this problem eventually. First, we must realize the solution for this problem is not like there's a sole solution or what. There are multiple solutions, like the aerosol or carbon, I can't remember that word. Those are all possible solutions, but like you have to take take significant risk for several industries, which would deeply hurt the benefit of many. Yet the research field is always free. That if I put more funds into more the basic realms of research, for example, food industry, like or more high efficient food procedure, or like I just simply set some standard for like for several industries that would So I basically, my opinion is to like I will put more fund in research realm and wish that those researchers could provide a method with lower costs and less risks, which would not harm a lot of people's benefits. That's all I could wish for. But since I'm quite pessimistic on this view, so this may not be a very satisfying answer, but that's all I could say.
Thank you both.
Okay, Brent, you still have about 2 minutes and 30 seconds if you have another question.
Sure. So my question to both of you is, when it comes, or specifically Gabe, I guess, when it comes to kind of the issue of removing profits from the equation and making sure that, everyone has access to green technology, whether it be cars or electricity or anything like that. Do you think it should come, do you think in the US, for example, that we should nationalize industries and then the US can just hand those things out? Or do you think that the US should buy X amount of cars from industries and then give them out?
I think we should personally nationalize, which I know seems very hypocritical because the US has famously gone after countries who have nationalized industries such as their oil industries and put massive sanctions on them. My main concern with the whole profit motive is that we're already seeing it play out in action with the COVID pandemic, okay? The United States, the majority of Europe, Japan, Australia, and Brazil, they all oppose waiving patent protections for the COVID-19 vaccines. So how can we make sure something like that doesn't happen with green technology? Because all the countries in the global south, the more impoverished countries, they want the patent protection for COVID vaccines to be waived. But if they're not, then, well, what are they going to do? That's why I'm concerned with the whole profit motive thing, is because if you are running, in this example, it would be an insurance company. If you're running an insurance company and you make this exception where you waive it and then everyone gets access to it, why would anyone want to go to how it was before, right? So that is exactly why I think there needs to be either an elimination or a severe lessening of the profit motive when it comes to tackling the issue of climate change.
All right, thank you. So I think that we can like move into another round of questioning if that's okay with you guys. I can give you each another like 10 minutes to ask a question. Does that sound good? Or okay, does that sound good? Awesome. Okay, so Jerry, if you have another question, you can ask that now.
Yeah, against Gabe's solution, like, how can you like, I mean, in a democratic country like US, like, how can you actually nationalize all industries? Like, I don't see any possibilities there.
Well, it would be a very difficult endeavor indeed, because obviously you're going to get a lot of pushback from people who, operate the fossil fuel corporations. But, the US has never been afraid in its history to, push back against some of those interests. Famously, for a while, there was only one oil company in the entirety of the US, Standard Oil, and then it was split up. Now, those same oil companies together probably still have massive influence and power, but, it's not as easy as it was before. And of course, there are industries that are, I guess you could say, pseudo-nationalized. The USPS is a good example, right? We treat postal service delivery as a service, right? But you still have things such as FedEx and UPS. But even those companies rely on the USPS, for example, to do, the last leg of the delivery. So even those private companies rely on public infrastructure and public um, uh, institutions in order to, achieve their own personal and private goals. Um, Again, the issue that I'm most concerned with is that looking at this COVID pandemic and how it has been, a quote unquote global answer, um, we're still, very much seeing, vaccine nationalism, for example. How are we going to make sure we don't see something like green energy nationalism? Because again, and I mentioned this earlier, but it was very briefly, for a lot of countries in the global south who are trying to industrialize, who are trying to enrich themselves, they are using the same techniques that the US used, that China used, that India used to get into the positions they were today. And that included using methods that would, damage the environment. So if we all of a sudden go up to them and say, hey, you can't use those same methods that we use to enrich ourselves, you guys got to find a different way, they're probably going to be very upset. So again, it is about making sure that there is as little private influence from people who care more about enriching themselves, enriching their families, than actually helping the collective world.
I mean, do you find like the former like enrich themselves like I don't know, like I just think it's not quite proper to put the universal interest above private interest. Like it's not only about the objection from like entrepreneurs, it's about like every people there. Like I agree that, for example, for like you gave an example of the Standard Oil, which then got broke into like several different companies, but that's the main reason for that breakdown is to solve the monopoly here, and monopoly would destroy the free market. But like if you simply like nationalize the whole industry, that just creates another monopoly, and this would indeed destroy the free market. Like the government does has this under control, but first it would deeply hurt all those interests of all those entrepreneurs, so they will object, and indeed it will create enormous job loss. And how are you going to solve that issue?
Well, the issue is that even if, say, the Standard Oil example, you break up uh, those companies are still going to try their best to monopolize, because that is the best way for them to achieve maximum profit margins, is to monopolize in some way, shape, and form. Right? I think only about like 5 companies own everything you see in the grocery store. So
Right.
again, when a company is more concerned about monopolizing and getting as much money as possible than, say, the collective good of the country or the planet in this case, it becomes very difficult to expect them to ever act out in the good of their own heart, right? You know,
Very true.
in terms of something like the housing crisis, for example, people say, well, the solution to the homelessness and the housing crisis is just, you know, unleash the free market, right? Well, what happens when we unleash the free market? Well, we get things like Airbnb, which haven't really necessarily helped out homelessness, now has it? So again, there needs to be at least, you know, less of a profit incentive, because we're already seeing it with the COVID pandemic, how, you know, private companies are going to prioritize the biggest payer than perhaps maybe those who actually need the vaccines the most. And that's what I fear might also happen with green energy. And it's just going to be a lot of bickering back and forth between countries, while again, time is ticking. We're running out of time here. So again, and I'm not saying my solution is a perfect solution either, but there needs to be more of a universal and a national solution or address to this problem. We shouldn't, the entire United States response to the climate crisis should not be beholden to whatever the CEO of ExxonMobil thinks.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer.
Do you have any more questions, Jay, or is that all?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give chance to talk to others.
Okay. With that being said, thank you, Jerry. Gabe, if you have any questions, you may pose them now.
Yeah, I have another one for Brant on geoengineering. So because geoengineering attempts to modify the global climate, people have said that it poses severe problems for governance, right? Democratic governance would require the establishment of a global multilateral democratic mechanism where all governments would participate on an equal basis, right? And a system like that would need to last for many decades, if not centuries. And decisions on deployment of geoengineering would then need to be taken by consensus. So if in fact this were possible, we wouldn't have a climate crisis, you know, in the first place, because governments would have been able to arrive at the international agreements to reduce emissions. The consensus reached on the goals of the Paris Agreement, for example, was a step in the right decision, but its guidance remains dominated by wealthy countries. And it only took a change of government in the US to withdraw from the agreement. So if a similar mechanism was used in decisions related to geoengineering, the agreements would be, you know, worrisomely unstable. So again, how would we address that issue?
Yeah, no, it's absolutely a fair one. Every time we're looking towards international solutions to international problems, one of the key issues is making sure that everyone's going to stay together and commit to working towards this solution. And I agree that, especially in this case, there could possibly be disagreements in the future, and it could threaten the viability of the solution. The problem is you're not weighing it against a vacuum. It's not like this has problems compared to nothing, which has no problems. You're comparing it to the alternative, which is an international agreement on regulation. So my belief is that alternative is a lot more difficult to maintain internationally. And you compare it to like, oh, if we had international cooperation, we wouldn't have had the climate crisis to begin with. While I agree, that form of international consensus is even more difficult to found. Because when it comes to reducing emissions, which is the example you point at, it's not like, oh, we're all agreeing where we're going to inject aerosols into the world. It's we all have to agree that we are going to decimate portions of our economies. And for some countries, like you've explained, that disproportionately hits them, and they don't have the war chest to continue to be viable without those sources of energy and carbon emissions, which means that like the alternative, which is we ignore geoengineering and we try to find an international consensus on regulation, that's way more difficult to uphold. Because once again, you know, like in an ideal world, we'll have people who are always like, pro climate, pro everything. But the truth is, we're always going to have around the world waves of conservatism in fiscal policy. And the truth is, when those regimes enter power, they're more likely to reverse international cooperations that harm that country's economy, which tends to be regulation and reducing carbon emissions, which is what you're talking about, than they would be then comparatively toward them like rolling back agreements on injecting aerosols into the world, which probably wouldn't hurt their economy that bad. So I agree with you. It is difficult to maintain those international agreements, but it's just comparing it to the alternative. And the alternative is much more difficult to maintain because it requires every country to collectively agree we are going to harm our economies for the betterment of everyone, versus this is, we're just going to agree where to shoot things up into the air while all our economies are pretty stable still.
Okay, thank you. This one is a bit more of a open-ended question. How would the concerns of, say, if we're doing this in a more international basis, how would countries that perhaps refuse to cooperate with each other on other international issues, land territory, conflicts over resources, things of the such, how would we be able to make sure they can set aside maybe their differences to work more collectively, specifically on the issue of climate change? Because I think it'd be very difficult to get countries like Japan and Taiwan to work with China, or to get a country like South Korea to work with North Korea on how to address with the climate crisis, particularly in the Korean Peninsula, or how to address how to have countries like Iran or Israel, Palestine to work on solving potential climate issues in the Middle East, right? Because these, outside of the issue of climate change, these are countries that have massive disputes, often bloody, with each other. But since climate change, the consequence of it would affect everybody, no matter which country you're from. Again, how do we make sure they can foster a healthy dialogue between countries which, in other senses, would never want to work with each other?
Yeah, no, that's valid. I'll just begin by saying that regardless of what my answer is to the question, this exact problem is going to occur regardless of what global climate solution you want to try and prioritize, which means that like, even if I don't have a good answer to this, the alternative is we do nothing and climate change kills everyone, which means that we want to it might not be the best answer, but like any answer is going to be an okay answer compared to the alternative. But then kind of going on to what you're saying, when it comes to forms of geoengineering, what's unique about geoengineering is when we implement policy, we don't necessarily need everyone to actually do it as well. Like if we could set up like a certain amount of carbon sequestration all around the world, since the atmosphere is global, then theoretically that would solve the impacts of climate change. Whereas when you compare it to like just reducing emissions, if we stop emitting, but China, Russia, Japan continue to emit, then we are still feeling the impacts of that. And there's nothing we can do to stop them, which means it kind of, when you're talking about reducing emissions, you need everyone on board. But when you talk about geoengineering, you only need enough people on board to start geoengineering. Once again, though, that arrives to the problem, which we talked about previously, which is if you don't need everyone, some people can kind of like make the decisions that tend to disproportionately affect groups that just can't get involved in the discussion, right? And I think that's a very valid concern, which is like, if all the developed countries at the UN decide like, oh, we're going to geoengineer, and they don't care where the impact is going to lie, then it's going to screw over a lot of other countries. Which is why I think one, we just have to hope that these countries are going to be willing to work together. But two is, the truth is, like Jerry was saying, we can't trust human nature, which means that we need to make sure that whatever substance we're going to inject into the air is as good and as safe as possible, which means that we need to invest as much money as we can as soon as possible to make sure that all the safety protocols are met. Which is why I think that focusing right now on regulation to limit carbon emissions and then kind of pushing along the idea of investing in R&D to figure out geoengineering to later is a big mistake. Because by the time that climate change starts to actually hit us and we haven't invested enough money into that research, the choice is either we get destroyed by climate change or we inject half-researched aerosols into the world, which are going to have the impacts that you're talking about. Which is, so I agree with you, it's a very big problem, but that's even more of a reason why we need to invest now and focus less on deregulation, or focus less on regulation and focus more on R&D spending.
Okay, one more question, very brief. How can we avoid a similar outcome that we are facing right now in terms of, vaccine nationalism? Because, again, if massive companies are going to be trying to spearhead the response to climate change with, their geoengineering technologies or their carbon capture technologies. I mean, they're going to probably patent that. And, how do we prevent something similar to, how do we prevent something happening similar to what's going on right now with the COVID vaccine, where you have all these giant countries in, the global north, Europe, Australia, Japan, the United States, Canada, how do we make it so that they don't then put the private interests of those corporations in, not wanting to waive maybe the patents for some of these green technologies to then not share them to the rest of the world, and especially in the global south?
Oh, I only have 30 seconds to answer this, Ambria. Okay, I'll shoot for a really short answer then. It won't be a full one.
You can go over, it's fine. I'll give
Okay.
you
So yeah, COVID right now, it's just indicative of a failure in the private market. I would 100% agree. And when we're talking about solutions on the international stage, which involve externalities, the private market isn't going to solve everything like you've addressed. Like the private market only works when externalities are priced in, which means that the US government needs to price in those externalities for these corporations. And in my solution, they absolutely can, because the US government is the one with all the bargaining power. Because in my solution, the US government is the one giving grants to my corporations to make sure that we can invest in this technology, which means that contingent on these grants, the US government can sign in contracts that are like, if you develop this technology, we get to buy the patent from you from a giant increase in money. And since that kind of solves the problem of like corporations holding onto the patents, which is the US can just negotiate it because they have all the leverage in this scenario. But two is one of the big problems with COVID isn't necessarily the vaccine rollout in the US. Like it's going great because the US negotiated with these companies kind of when they were developing the vaccines. The problem is we aren't getting those vaccines out to the rest of the world. And the reason why is when we were dealing with COVID, we weren't using an international approach. Every country was focused on their own country's response. So that's why I think when it comes to climate change, something that's going to impact everyone, we need to start looking at international solutions. And once we have that lens going into the process, then when we start to talk about these grants, we can build in international components into these grants that will require, selling it abroad at a cheap price or frankly free in the form of loans, so that in the future, when these countries start to develop, they can start to pay it back. But I agree, like COVID has sucked, and the reason why is because they didn't have that international lens when they were choosing to invest and work with these corporations. And the second thing is another reason why COVID sucked, like our response, is because the US didn't have the negotiating power. These corporations did because everyone's dying without the vaccine, and so they get to wave around the vaccine and say, hey, you want it, give me money. Versus right now, corporations don't have carbon sequestration yet, so the government giving them the grant has all the negotiating power.
All right, thank you. Sorry, Jerry, I'm not ignoring you. I promise.
That's fine.
All right, so thank you, Gabe and Brant. So Brant, you'll now have like 10 minutes to ask a question.
I can also do like half since I took up a lot of time there. But Jerry first, you talked kind of about like it's difficult to find solutions. But one of the main ones that you were talking about is you just want more money into basic research so we can start to try and solve those issues create solutions that we don't necessarily have right now. So I was kind of want to push that a bit more and ask, where is this money coming from? Where is the money going? Is it more in terms of governmental research, which is kind of what Gabe is advocating for? Or do you think this is sort of money that we should be sending to the private sector to compete and try and come up with solutions? Can you just talk a bit more in depth about your solution about putting money toward research?
Sure. Well, I'm considering putting money in both of the settings you mentioned, like both private and public. I mean, I just need someone to get a good method. So here's my logic, because like I've said that we can't trust human nature, that like they wouldn't hurt their own benefit, like to benefit. They wouldn't hurt their own interest to benefit the whole. So the thing I'm thinking right now is like, since US is like a quite rich country, so people are now aware of this climate issue, but it would make no sense for us to like asking other poor countries to do such thing, because that would be the immediate destruction, like for their whole system. So my approach would rather be that, like it's more the thing that I'm hoping for is another technology, I would say revolutionary, just like industrial revolutionary, like several hundred years ago, that we could like, well, the industry revolution, like it brings significantly increase in our basic social productivity, which brings enormous advantage to everyone. And I would rather follow that path, but this time we were trying to develop the same kind of method which would reach, which would satisfy the same kind of material needs of everyone. It's just cleaner, you know, like we want cleaner methods, but like we don't need to risk too high to replace old industries with then new methods. Like for example, the vegan food industry, like it's getting very popular, like because it's replaced it. Like, I think right now it is, although it is a relatively new industry, but I think it coexists well with the traditional meat industry. And once people have tried that, once people have realized that they can still have something close to meat, but like they don't, but like if they have that kind of vegan meat, they could do significant benefit to the whole environment. There would be no thing that would actually impede them from doing that, because it wouldn't hurt their interest. So that's my whole argument. Like we must need a more mild way instead of like a radical social reform, like Gabe proposed, like nationalize the whole industry. I just don't think that's quite realistic.
Thank you. That answers my question. Yeah.
Do you have any more questions, Brett?
Try to think of one for Gabe that we haven't already covered. Sure, I can have a question. So for Gabe, so the policies that you're advocating for, similar to mine, are big government policies, ones that would theoretically cost billions, if not trillions of dollars in spending. What's the best way you think that not only the US, but other countries can fund these, endeavors? Like they're very expensive. Do you have a plan internationally for those other countries to fund this kind of research?
Well, in terms of the US, I know certainly the US could do a lot of things. We are the richest country in the world. I am not really a fan of us having a $700 billion military budget. I think we should cut that quite significantly and use a lot of that money to fund, again, green energy research is one thing. You can also do a lot of other things. And homelessness is one example. As for other countries, that's a lot more of a more difficult question because, you know, these other countries are have their own, you know, unique circumstances. My main concern again is how do we get countries that are, you know, in the global south who, you know, don't have much GDP on their own to be able to utilize these types of technologies and methods to contribute in the fight against climate change. You know, because I don't think, you know, South Africa would be happy to, you know, cut half their military budget, right? So, you know, my main concern again is making sure these countries that don't have a lot of resources can take advantage of resources that perhaps the US or the EU, countries in the global north can create in order to make sure that they can contribute in the fight against climate change, not only to protect the planet, but to also, you know, better the lives of their own citizens. Another thing I think that needs to be done is to, and I mentioned this very briefly in my opening statements, but to message the severity of the climate change a lot more intensely. I am not a fan of these, you know, band-aid proposals like, you know, banning plastic straws. I mean, it's good, don't get me wrong, but paper straws make up 0.025% of the plastic that, you know, or sorry, not paper straws. Plastic straws make up 0.025% of the plastic that finds its way into the ocean, you know, for example. So, you know, I think by turning the climate change issue into a personal fault is very misleading, because you can drive electric cars, unplug appliances, take public transportation. You can do all you can to eliminate your carbon footprint. But when massive corporations and governments are still being the leading causes of climate change, and you're still seeing the consequences play out, you're going to feel hopeless. And unfortunately, I think some people have already kind of come to that realization. So I think obviously you should do whatever you can personally to, you know, fight against climate change. But, you know, it needs to be something that, you know, the people who have perpetuated it for it getting this bad need to also, you know, they need to foot the bill, is all I'm saying.
All right, thank you. I think that's all my questions.
Awesome. Okay, so that basically concludes our, I guess, formal debate. I'm going to ask you guys a couple of questions just to like wrap things up. So the purpose of this was to basically understand each side's arguments and understand different ways for us to like move forward. So I guess my first question is, do you understand each other's like disagreements? Like, do you understand each person's position? Okay, awesome. And then my second question is, have your thoughts about how to address climate change changed based off of this discussion? Have your previous thoughts been, you know, altered?
In some ways, yes. In other ways, I do still hold my same opinions. For example, you know, Jerry's whole thing about not trusting human nature is essentially how I feel, but replace human nature with corporations. And particularly on the topic of human nature, you know, I think it's a very broad answer, because, you know, human nature, yes, will tell us to be greedy and to do selfish things, but human nature also tells us to, you know, care for others, show compassion, build community, you know, help others. And I think all of those, you know, should definitely will definitely play a role in terms of combating climate change, because it's not just you know, an issue that affects you. It affects everybody. It affects your neighbors, affects your state, affects your county, affects your country, affects your planet. Of course, that is very difficult to message here in America, because we are very much we have rugged individualism deeply entrenched into our social conditioning. But I do think that, as much of a cynic that I am in most things, I think that as many things human nature can be used to make us do harmful things, it can also be used to influence us to do good things.
Brant or Jerry, have your opinions changed?
Yeah, but it's more on a solution basis that Brent's idea actually gave me. Brent's idea actually gave me a good approach, that because he mentioned that although that government could not like try to nationalize the whole industry, but what government could do is to give grants to those companies that actually inspires those ideologies of being green and I don't know, being green and energy saving. Like, that's what they can do. And yes, I did say that we can't trust human nature, but in a sense, like we must use human nature to eventually reach every possible goals. Like, for example, like the grant case, that since they won this grant, and then it will be possible for them to receive those revolutionary ideas. So yes, I would think this is rather huge steps in my whole logical system, like towards the solution of the whole issue here. Yeah.
Awesome. Brent?
Yeah. Am I supposed to still stay in role, or am I talking as an individual?
You're
All right,
talking as an individual.
Okay, as myself. Okay. So I can share a bit of my internal thinking now. I do think geoengineering is a great idea for the future. That's why, like, there are a lot of corporate positions I could have taken in terms of this climate debate. The main one, probably, that they always go for is the economy version. But personally, I do believe climate change is an existential threat that, even if you look through an economy lens, is going to create so much more problems than we could just give the money now and solve the solutions. But I do believe geoengineering is going to be a necessity to try and go carbon negative in the future. But if I'm going to talk about my personal beliefs now, I also do believe that regulations on corporations are necessary, kind of what Gabe was talking about, as well as Jerry, because the truth is, this technology, carbon sequestration, is going to take 10 to 20 years. And the truth, we don't have that much time, which means that it's necessary now to implement regulation to slow down carbon emissions so we can buy the time to develop geoengineering to solve those problems. So I completely agree with Jerry and Gabe that we need to put in regulations now on corporations to slow the speed of climate change. But I also do believe in my point, which is, at the same time, we need to be investing in geoengineering so that when the time comes, we are ready to fight that battle.
Awesome. Okay, so those are all the questions that I had. I guess that kind of just wraps up our debate. Thank you guys so much for participating.